Welcome to True North Project. This is Christian. Today, my guest is Tyson Adams, who is a coach and facilitator of men's work. He specializes in helping men heal from porn addiction. You can connect with Tyson on Instagram at Tyson Adams. Today, in this conversation, topics that we explored are porn addiction and the tragedy of our attention commons, the dystopian threat of AI-generated porn, and AI agents and virtual reality experiences, unshaming of sexuality and transitioning from porn addiction to sacred sexuality, and intentional sexual practices and sexual hygiene for men, what that looks like, how we can break the circumcision cycle and help heal the masculine feminine wound. And we discuss sacred masculinity and intentionally harnessing your life force energy as a man. So, we clearly have a porn problem in our culture. We're quite addicted. So that's kind of the launching point of this conversation. And this is Tyson's work. He helps men. He's helped hundreds of men heal and transform their lives and step beyond, an addiction to porn. So that's the flavor of today's conversation. And I think it's really, really important. It's something that I've had my own journey with, as I can imagine most, if not all, men and a lot of women who are listening to this have been on that same journey. And it wasn't until we talked about this on the podcast, but it wasn't until I was 25 when I really started to shift and break that cycle. So I can't speak enough about how important that was, and reclaiming your life force energy and your attention and your intention around sexuality. So hope you enjoy this conversation with Tyson Adams. Much love. All right, man. Tyson, my man, welcome to our little neck of the woods, our little corner of the universe, True North Project, where I sporadically have conversations that are not at all consistent. So it's been a minute since I recorded one of these. So it's forgive me while I shake off the cobwebs. Mm-hmm. Welcome, though. It's good to see you, dude.
Thank you. I'm super jazzed to be here. We have a lot of intersecting interests, so let's go for it.
Yeah. So we met, the first time I actually met you, it was funny. We were walking through the airport, and this was it Grand Junction?
Yep.
Or no. It was actually I want to say it was like connecting to Grand Junction. Maybe it was Phoenix or something like that. We were like on a connecting flight, I believe. Because I'm pretty sure
I think it was Grand Junction. I think we landed there and you were with somebody else. And then I was with Corey. So yeah, I think it was Grand Junction.
Mm-hmm. So we were going for a canyons course. It's like a 10-day or 7-day backpacking sort of wilderness. And what would you call it? Like a leadership training, something like that.
Yep.
So with Jamie Will and the Flow Genome Project, and I was walking through the airport, and I see you and Corey walking, and I'm like kind of walking behind you guys or something, and I overhear what you're talking about. I'm like, oh, these dudes are for sure going to canyons. And then I noticed you had one of those little pine cone necklaces, and I'm like, oh, that's an FGP initiate if I've ever seen one. So that's where I introduced myself to you, and then the rest is history. Went down into the canyons, and that's kind of how we got connected. And I found that just the quality of humans that I encounter through FGP seems to be pretty high caliber. So I knew that there was there'd be a lot to talk about with you. But what is it that brought you to FGP in the first place? And what would you, if you had to just put it in your own words, what would you say is FGP?
Mm-hmm. Well, my story of actually reaching into the FGP community is actually a very unique and interesting one. It was actually a psychedelic story. And I've shared this story with Jamie before, but I've never shared this publicly. But this would have been about a year before I actually trained and did my first canyon trip. The trip that you and I met, I actually was my second time going into the canyon. So I actually had gone 2 years earlier as well. And so But about a year before I actually trained with FGP, I was with my men's group, and we were out in Jacumba, which is west of San Diego. And we were all together doing a mushroom journey. And I had taken a big journey. I'd taken 10 grams. So I was in it. I was deep in it. And we were coming out the tail end, and it was quite the experience. And it was dark out, and when everybody was around the campfire kind of getting dinner ready, I was still pretty high, but I was on my way down, thank God. And I remember just sitting there, and I was taking a piss. And my intention going into this experience was that I wanted to see the universe as infinitely full. I wanted to see the plenum as not space, but the interconnectedness of it all. That was my intention going in. And so I'm sitting there taking a pee, and I looked up at the sky. And usually when I look up at the sky, I look at the individual stars themselves or the individual moon, and I focus in on the actual star. And for whatever reason, in this particular moment, I decided to not do that. I decided to look in between the stars, in between two prominent stars, and kind of just allow my vision to kind of blur and blend into that space between the stars. And out of nowhere, those two stars just connected with like a light line, just like boom. And then the next line connected, and the next line, and then the next line. And then all of a sudden, the whole sky completely lit up into like a bright white light, and then pop. And it went back to normal. And I was like, what the hell was that? And in that moment, the idea came to me, which was, you're going to train with Jamie Wheel in the FGP community. And I was like, what? And I had no idea really who he was, actually. The only thing I knew was that I had heard him on Kyle Kingsbury podcast, and that was it. That was the only context I had for him. I was like, this guy's a wild man. And so I walked over to my men's group, sat down, and I said, guys, I'm going to train with Jamie Wheel. And my buddy Chase Reeves, who lives out in Austin, who came with me on that first Canyons trip, he goes, I like that guy. That guy's crazy. He, and then Chase is like, I heard him on the Kyle Kingsbury podcast. I was like, I heard him on that podcast too. And so we started jamming about it, and nobody else really knew who he was. And then, everything died down. We went to our separate places, separate homes. We, like the trip ended. And then about maybe 9 months, maybe not a full year, but 9 months later, I said, hey, Chase, you want to go on the Canyons trip? And so we both signed up and went. And then that was it. And so I've been, training with Jamie ever since, and it's been fucking fantastic, but such a wild way to enter that community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. So what would you, so that's like what sparked it, but what would you say has been the reason for training? And what have you taken away from it? Like, has it grown any corn in your life? Have you seen any fruits from the work you put in and the time you put in and the training you've done?
Yeah. So coming out of the Canyons, I had done the year before, I had done 35 or so major psychedelic journeys going into the Canyons.
You're saying, wait, in that year?
In that year. Yeah. I was like,
wow,
full speed ahead, going for it.
And by the way, 10 grams for anyone who's wondering, that's a dangerously high dose of anything, like of mushrooms. That's scary. It's terrifyingly high.
Yes, I've done it twice, and I'm done with those big doses, but learned the lesson. So I had been effectively just going hard in the paint, you could say. So when I came out of the Canyons, after having a numerous amount of conversations with Jamie, I decided to take an entire year of complete sobriety. And so I went full turkey, full stop, just like cut it all out, no microdosing, like pretty much modern monkhood. So no porn, no sex, no relationship, like basically celibacy and sobriety, and also no personal development, no therapy, nothing. So that was the first time in my life that I ever really like paused all things. And in that year, my business and working with men in the coaching practice that I have, that I'm still now, doing, emerged out of that year of sobriety and celibacy. So the work I do full time is actually born of that canyon trip and kind of the nature of coming out of that and having a reboot and a
Yeah,
pause.
the canyons is like any wilderness trip's a great reset, right? Away from the technology drip, the blue light, the constant attention sucks of modernity, and in addition to just like the circadian rhythm reset, the cleaner food, getting out into nature, and all that kind of stuff. It's like a rewilding of sorts. So it seems like that was like gave you an insight into like, oh, this I need to like go through some sort of maybe detox phase of just like purifying my space and my mind and my body of all of the shit that's and even the good shit too. Like this is the idea of the hedonic calendar is like you can have these peak states or these uh you know moments of inspiration and these catalysts of transformation, but you don't want to get stuck in this bind where you're like always going back to the wishing well. You're always trying to go chasing the dragon, trying to one up your last experience. So there needs to be some sort of banks or structure for that. Hopefully, otherwise you can, kind of. And I tend to do this. Is like I think you and I are similar. Is like I tend to bend more towards hedonism than I do puritanism or whatever you'd say. Like I have done the aesthetic thing as well, where I've been, like fasted, and I haven't done it for a full year of like complete sobriety. But I tend to do more of the hedonistic thing. So having the structure in place is something that I think is really important for me. And it's something that I want to get better at as far as like being very intentional with how I spend my ecstasis calories, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The calendaring piece is huge. I just took the flow fundamentals for the first time, just finished the 6-week or the 5-week course, or actually 6-week course. And that was a huge part of it. The hedonic calendaring, power hour, flow states, breath, all that kind of stuff. Even though I'd already heard all of these things, it was good to actually take it in succession. And I'm in that sort of cleaning up phase and process of really building my hedonic calendar again for the second time, but actually doing it with more commitment and to just more boundaries, because I'm like you, I can spin into hedonism, as I mentioned, and get lost in it. And if you can't grow corn from it, then you're losing it. So a great example of that is I just got out of an ayahuasca journey and I saw this vision for what I want to do with my business, and I'm taking action towards enacting this, doing an actual retreat in Austin and actually bringing men in for it. And so this is all like being put in play. But again, going back to the importance of that is ensuring that if you're not actually being able to enact in this 3D world the things that you see in these visionary experiences, you're likely just in that hedonic sort of cycle. I think Jamie said it best the other day. He said the only difference between the alchemist and the addict is the scoreboard. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It can be it's a slippery slope, right? I think that just like with anything, you get kind of failure modes on both ends of the polarities, both sides, where you can have the addict, or you can have, someone kind of spinning out in Chapel's Perilous, as Anton Wilson would describe it, like where you can't really connect with anyone else in base reality, and you're sort of, it's like you left the ship and you didn't have a tether and you can't find your way back, right? So that sucks. And then on the other side of the fence, and the other polarity failure mode might look something like the conformist, who's so entrenched in a rigid way of seeing reality that and so stuck inside the walled garden, you know what I mean, where it's like you can't try anything because it's too taboo, or you can't put on anyone else's worldview or try on any new ideas or read any books that challenge your perspective or anything like that, because you're really inside of a tight little worldview. And you're trying to stay safe in there, but those walls of safety become your prison, right? So either one of those isn't really optimal. And I think what you're looking for is like the middle way, polarity management, which is something that, FGP trains on in their Leading Through Fire course, Bill Urey's work and stuff like that. But or I guess that would be positive. No, it's who is it that did the polarity management? It's a different guy. But the point is you want to have the best of both and try to avoid the failure modes of both, right? So having, that curiosity, that open to new experience, nothing wrong with getting your heart blown open with an ecstatic experience, right? And healing and those types of things. I mean, we're in profound need of that in some sense. Like our society, most people could probably use a healthy psychedelic initiation if it was done, and that's the big caveat, healthy and like a culturally, like a sacred container that's held in some sort of cultural, ethical, ethical culture, right? That's the sort of what we're shooting for, is like some sort of powerful rite of passage that connects you in service with something greater than yourself and holds you in a field of intimacy and value with your tribe, and without, going off the rails into culty cult land. So that's a lot, but I think we're definitely in need of that. And you can also see how there's this, as somebody who's, a psychonaut and a seeker as yourself and as myself, we've both seen the space where, the people lose the path and it turns into just the lizard brain fuck monkey hitting the novelty button, right? And kind of sensation seeking. So I'm really interested about like how you, as somebody who's like been on, I don't know how many journeys, but you were saying you did just 30 in that year leading up to Canyons. And then you've also done like the year of sobriety, and not just from drugs, but abstaining from like sex and just like pleasure seeking of all flavors. How do you see, because those are both kind of extremes, right? Like hardcore going for it hard in the paint, and then also like abstaining completely. So how do you see that weaving together in like a healthy upward spiral, sort of virtuous cycle in your own life?
Yeah. So as it specifically pertains to psychedelics, I think it's about understanding that I like to have a team of people that are supporting me. And what I mean by that is I have several therapists. I have basically one psychotherapist who comes from an ayahuasca family. So she's kind of a master in being able to understand psychospiritual things. And then I had two other psychedelic therapists that I was working with as well. Those, I'm not necessarily working with them anymore, but having a team was really important to me. And then in addition to that, having the nervous system related practices. So anytime I do a big journey, I either go to the ocean or I do ice baths and then go do float tanks, journal. I have a pretty extreme protocol of how to re-enter the world. You and I spoke about that the other day. It's not about the journey, it's about re-entry, right? Like how do we gracefully re-enter this world after we've had peak experiences? And I think that that's all about planning. And when we plan those properly, then we can bring a lot more back from those states. Going back to what you said earlier, though, about most people just needing to have a cathartic release, I would agree. It took me years of having cathartic releases before I was even capable of bringing anything back and actually enacting it in the 3D world. So I think there is a degree of not having that as a barrier or one of those things that you're holding yourself accountable to. I mean, maybe it's just something as simple as I'm going to do this, and then when I come through it, whatever that catharsis is, I'm going to have one hard conversation with somebody, or I'm going to have one small thing that I do. So I think that's kind of the importance there. But answering your question directly, as far as how to weave extreme hedonism versus, let's just call it modern monkhood, what is the actual balance? And I would say that it really comes down to the actual hedonic calendar, the actual planning and being very intentional and having guardrails with that, but then also having a little bit of flexibility. For example, I was like, I'm going to do a year of sobriety. And then I got to like month 11, and I was like right at the edge. And then one of my best friends was moving out of San Diego, and he's like, hey, I want to bring everybody together to have this event. I want to do mushrooms. And I was like, oh my gosh, am I going to really, break my sobriety a month early? And I did, and it was the right decision, and it was like perfect. But my point more so is just understanding that we can be really rigid sometimes. We can either be completely just loosey goosey, or we can be so rigid that we can't actually live in the flow of life. So
yeah. So you work with men, and as I understand it, you work with men quite a bit around sexuality or sacred sexuality. I'll let you describe that and how you'd characterize what you do with men and how you work with men. But yeah, I'm curious about how you see that balance of sort of hedonism, asceticism, or whatever, and how that relates to your sexuality and like a sexual practice. And this can be like a very taboo topic for guys too. Like I feel like we're still just sort of coming out of the shadows when in terms of decriminalizing desire, decriminalizing sexuality, and we can talk about like the reasons for that, like why sexuality has been so taboo throughout the ages, and the sort of superpowers that it can give you. You know what I mean? If used intentionally and if harnessed properly, like that, it can be actually like a really powerful gift. It can also be a curse that's like sort of just taking you further down, into the weeds. So how do you, what do you do, and how do you see your work with sexuality, specifically with men?
mm-hmm. Yeah, so I came into this field of working with men and sexuality, through my own traumas in and around it. I was exposed to pornography at a very young age. At 9 years old, found my first Playboy in a hole, Vanna White Playboy. I still remember that. And then my hometown, which is in Ephrata, which is in Washington State, we were the first town in America to get fiber wire put under the ground. And so I went from no internet to high-speed internet. And so there was a program called Kazaa, which was basically kind of like LimeWire, but you could just download anything and there was no thumbnails. So you would just type in a search term and then boom, whatever came out, you would be watching. So all of my orientation in and around sexuality was basically programmed through the pornography before I even had pubic hair, before I even hit puberty, before I had ever even had a girlfriend or even had a kiss. And so I was being effectively indoctrinated into this way that this is how sex is through the porn raising me. And, when I have connection calls with men, I always ask the same question. So let me ask you, did you have anybody in your life, any elder guidance when you were transitioning from boyhood into manhood, when you were making that jump in your life? And 99% of the men that come through and talk to me, they're like, no, not at all. And so I always say, well, let me guess, then you were raised by the porn or just, sort of locker room talk with the other guys. And they're like, yep. And so what I say to men in that is I say, the important thing to understand is that it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility because it is your life. Would you agree? And they usually say, yeah, I agree. And so the reason why I start there is because it's important to help men unshame whatever their sexual behavior is as fast as possible, because most men are blaming themselves for whatever their unwanted sexual behavior is, or whatever their sexual behavior is in the world, whether that's sex addiction or porn addiction or whatever it might be. So I'm really good at helping men unshame their sexuality, and then men just literally dump it all, and they'll share the most intense things that they've never shared with anybody with me. So I'm constantly on the receiving end of that. And that's really the work I do. But the main thing that I do is helping men go from porn addiction to being an embodied lover and or becoming multi-orgasmic. So what are the steps from an addictive using sex and masturbation to feel better to becoming an embodied lover, multi-orgasmic, where sex and masturbation is a means to better feel? And when we're here, we're thinking our way to orgasm. And when we're here, we're feeling our way to orgasm. And that's a very different way of relating to sexuality.
Cool. So just to like sort of unpack this a little bit, I think it might be worth hovering on or double clicking on the aspect of the shame and the cultural sort of what's the best way to say it? Like there's an elephant in the room, right? And the elephant in the room is that you can just look at the fucking data and say, just based on this trend, this data of like porn site traffic, website traffic, we can just assume that there's like a massive porn addiction problem, and that there's all kinds of shit going on behind the curtain. Not even, I mean, I live in Vegas and it's not that far behind the curtain. It's kind of like front and center. It's like on center stage here, where it's just like, the relationship to sexuality, say, in Vegas, is a very superficial one, and it's more of like that think your way to orgasm type of thing, right? And it's an objectification, and there's sort of this like materialistic reductionistic sort of flavor to it. And I would say, just like everything else and I like to pick on Vegas because I'm here, but it's pervasive throughout our society and civilization. It's not specific to Vegas. Vegas just tends to be the fucking poster child of it. And people come to Vegas to kind of get that out. So what I'm trying to get to, though, is that there's this surface shines inside rots thing. There's like a profaning of the sacred. And so just because like I want every guy who might be listening to this to just be to come into the recognition that like, hey dude, like you're not alone in this. Like I watched porn as a teenager. I wasn't 9. I was probably like maybe like 12 or 13 the first time I saw porn, So, but still it was like, there was a gateway entrance there too, for all of us, for most of us. We all grew up in this age. We're the first generation who's really had this level of access, where you can, imagine your ancestor who's going to see like a couple naked women in his lifetime, you know what I mean? Or like a few dozen or whatever, to like thousands or millions, of just bodies. So there's a desensitizing that happens and that occurs. And there is a form of trauma that's happening because you're kind of you go from like innocent child to being waterboarded by all of the dark shadows of our psyche, our collective psyche. So what you said you're on the receiving end of sort of in some sense these confessions, right? Like people, because there's something really cathartic about just confessing, about just speaking what you've been a part of, what's happened to you, or what you've done to someone else, or what kind of habits or whatever that you've got. And so could you just sort of like maybe speak to the intensity and the depth of the problem as you see it, as somebody who's been like doing this work, talking to all these men who are seeking to transform their lives and to heal their relationship with sexuality? Can you speak to like and characterize really like to the extent that you see it, what's going on in the landscape with our current civilization in 2024 and sexuality with just men?
Yeah. So let's start with the big picture and let's quantify it. And then I'll go into the actual impact that has on the individual. So you were talking about how there's large amounts of men that are actually going and watching this stuff. So I wanted to quantify that. So I looked at some sort of SEO website, and I pulled up the top 30 websites in America, and 5 of those websites are porn sites. So we got Pornhub, XX videos, there's like 3, I can't remember the name of it, but I mean, there's OnlyFans and then X Hamster. There's like 3 of them that start with X. And so I always get confused. But those 5 websites garner 6.35 billion visits per month. Okay. So then I was like, okay, well, I have no idea how to like think about that. That's a lot. So then I was like, okay, well, let's just see how that equates to, let's say, an amount of semen. So I had this thought like, well, how much semen is that? So then I thought to myself, okay, well, not all 6.35 billion are actually ejaculating. Some maybe are women, maybe some men are going there and they're not ejaculating, they're just looking. And so then I was like, okay, we'll just say it's 5 billion. So then I was like, okay, well, what is 5 billion per month visits of ejaculations? How much semen is that? So then I looked at a tablespoon as an average ejaculation. And I equated that to Olympic-sized pools.
Ugh.
And it's one Olympic-sized pool per day that is going into fucking the void of nothing. So do we have a porn problem? I would say we have a porn problem. We definitely are addicted culturally. And if you think about that from a Taoist perspective, one drop of semen is equivalent to 30 drops of blood in terms of life force. So understanding that it's a lot of creative energy going into nothing. And imagine if we learn to transmute that raw sexual energy into focus, drive, and flow, into our businesses, into our relationships, into our children, into the music that's still inside of us that wants to come out, right? And the way that I help men to get on board logically for this transition is to look at it as a physiological being, meaning, well, what is actually in our semen and our seminal fluid and in our prostatic fluid when we come? And so I boil it down to like brass tacks, which is proteins, amino acids, vitamins, minerals, and sugars. And it's a lot of them. And so when that's going out faster than we can regenerate it, then it pulls on the hypothalamus and the endocrine system to reproduce our seminal fluid. And our hypothalamus is the modulator and remote control of our entire lives. It's sleep, it's mood, it's hunger, it's thirst, it's body temperature, it's memory, it's our testosterone, it's pretty much everything. And so what I say to men is I say, when you masturbate so often all the time or regularly, let me guess, when you get low of energy, at the end of that ejaculation, do you reach for other shit to pull you back up? And they're like, what do you mean? And I go, Adderall, caffeine, sugar, Netflix. Is there any other things that you habitually do when you're low on energy because you've masturbated? And they're like, yes. And every man has another crutch when he's low that he reaches for. So then I say, okay, now that you're logically on board for this, can we now move into the second piece, which is what is the actual impact of doing this on the psyche and on the soul of the individual, right? So start with big picture, then physiological, and then, okay, well, how is this impacting your relationship to yourself and your relationships as a whole? So
Yeah. There is, I mean, the image of an Olympic pool full of jizz is a rattling one, but that's one way to quantify it, I guess. I think we're basically in a world where, I think it's like some ridiculous number, like 30% of website traffic or something like that is just porn related. So there's just this obvious thing, which is, you can't even call it an elephant in the room because it's so obvious. It's like a third of like our attention is just being sucked into this type of attention. Like it's just an attention suck. It's kind of like how, our big food is basically just addicting people with palate hacking, stuff. It's all about just like, how does this taste? And then you're getting hooked on like a dopamine circuit from like, sugar, salt, fat, and really has nothing to do. I mean, the people manufacturing that food, because it's a manufactured process, it's not really like a hunter-gatherer process. Like there's no real connection or sacred reciprocity to the food. So, it's really just a product that's being manufactured to addict a customer because that's the best kind of customer. And the same thing's happening in porn. I mean, it's a race to the bottom, right? And we're losing not just our attention, there's like kind of our souls on some level, right? Like, and you said, we're just wasting this life force, and imagine what we could be doing with this, if it was used in a creative, positive, purposeful way. But I would say it's even worse than just wasting it. There's actually a negative byproduct or a negative effect. It's not just neutral, right? It's not just like, oh, bummer, we wasted some potential. It's like you're actually digging yourself a deeper hole, in my opinion. And I've been addicted to porn as a teenager, and in my early 20s is when I think I was probably 25 or 24, 25. I think it's 25 when I like completely just cut that out of my life. And it was difficult, it took a couple of tries before I was able to actually get it to stick. And it wasn't until it was actually Mark Manson's masturbation diet and I read his stuff. He has a couple of really good books. But that's what ended up giving me the tool I needed to to sort of shift into a more intentional sexuality practice. But and it also transformed my relationship to women, of course, right? Like there's that's something we haven't really talked about yet, but there's this relationship between with your sexuality and how you relate to, women or whatever, whoever you're attracted to, right? And however you identify sexually. But if you're sort of just like venting this off, in this sort of consumptive way, then there's no real connection. You can't really cultivate that connection with other human beings. And so that's what I mean by it's not just neutral. There's this real cost that you have to pay. And I think that sadly, especially the younger generations, there's this whole phenomenon of specifically, I mean, I don't want to just put it on boys or men, because I think it's women who deal with it too. But there's this sort of isolating, more and more so, this isolated generation where we're just getting those pleasure buttons kind of hit and those needs met by artificial means, right? And it's going to become even more and more so that way with the rise of AI generated content. And now you're getting like curated explicit content specifically for like what you're into, and it's generating it for you. And so it's super, super dialed in and niched down into like just your preferences. And then you add to that, some robots for like some physical stimulation and some haptic feedback. And you just end up with humans who are just like fucking stuck inside of this sex matrix where they can never escape. So I see like this dystopia where we're like kind of like sliding off the cliff down into this super compulsive, consumptive place instead of channeling and harnessing the life force energy of cosmos. Like the sexual energy is your life force energy. So it's like you are really just like, if you're leaking that out in unintentional compulsive ways, like you're putting a hard ceiling above your potential of like what you can actually do. Would you agree with that characterization of that I kind of jump into?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. If you want to go down the rabbit hole of AI porn, virtual girlfriends, VR porn, camming, and the intersection of robotics and how that's all intersecting, I'm happy to go there with you. I've done a ton of research on it, and I've also gone into some of those spaces and actually witnessed it myself. And it's terrifying. And the reason why I say it's terrifying is because when you look at pornography as it is today, just without the AI stuff, you have to remember, just like social media, if something's free, you are the product. And so they've commercialized our life force, which is our ejaculations, effectively. The more they can get you to stay on their sites, they can feed you ads. That's how they get paid. And so part of this is sort of that awareness. But the thing is with that type of porn, you need an actual porn star, you need a studio, you need to actually bring people in and pay them. Well, now with AI porn, you don't need any human beings. And therefore, the tech bros have gotten into this, and they've basically figured out how to use the DALL-E and all of these image generators, and they're coding on top of it to build out these AI porn bots and these platforms where you go in and you search, and you can basically have whatever you want, including age, size, skin color, facial features, facial expression. For me, that's the scariest one, because it has like options, which is like, do you want her to look sad or scared or angry? Or it's just weird to me. And then within seconds, boom, there it is. And so for me, what that does is it's creating a demand for perfection. And that's not how it really works. That's not how it works in the real world. When you have a real relationship with somebody, there's always going to be things that don't suit you as far as a real human being goes. But now with AI, it's like, oh, I can have perfection. I want perfection. Oh, I can have it now. Oh, well, that feeds my narcissism. Oh, wow. Now I'm actually creating a situation where I'm able to get what I want now in that immediacy. And if you're out there and you're listening to this and you are watching porn and you are watching AI porn, this is not intending to shame you in any way. It's not. It's more me saying, hey, be careful, because there's an addictive quality to the actual porn, but there's also an addictive quality to the capacity to create whatever the hell it is you want. And every single insatiable desire that you have is available to you. And with the AI porn, it's pay to play. So here, I'll give you the first 2 images for free, but now you got to put in your credit card. So now not only are these AI porn companies commercializing your life force, your actual seminal fluid and stuff, but they're also taking your money too, because other porn is free. So it's just like, we're going down a very, very dystopian, road, as you mentioned. And I'm terrified, to be honest, because it doesn't end well effectively.
Yeah. You can, I mean, so this is there's a bigger, I've talked on this podcast in the past quite a bit about this idea of Moloch and the multipolar trap sort of race to the bottom dynamic. You could call it, this is another example of a tragedy of the commons, right? So if you think of our collective life force energy, sexual life force energy as the commons, as a commons, right? You could call it the total creative capacity of humanity, right? Like because that's directly in my mind correlated to sexual life force, right? Energy. So there's a commons there where it's just like how our breathable air, our air needs to be breathable and clean, and our sacred waters need to be clean and looked after. And in the same way, our life force energy has to be intentionally cultivated and looked after. And what we have is an incentive because of the open market and these sort of biological drivers, right, that we evolved with, where we've got sort of these pleasure buttons, we've got these sort of needs, and they're kind of baked in at the hardware level as a tribal primate. So you've got all these different needs, not just the sexual ones, but the needs for belonging and the needs for, food, shelter, clothing, all these different things. And because of those needs baked in, there's this market incentive to sort of figure out how to hack past somebody's choice straight into the hard line into their biological needs, right? And just basically control them through whether it's addicting them to click and through watching and views, or just attention in that regard, or whether it's sexual in nature like pornography and AI bots and escorts and all these different, that's a whole rabbit hole. Or whether it's food or whatever, there's all these different ways that we can hack it. And so there's essentially an extraction process happening, just like how a mining company goes to a pristine ecosystem and then starts extracting for like a narrow metric, like silver or like cobalt or some metal that it wants. And all of the other externalities, the mining tailings and the waste that are poisoning the rivers and that are clearing the ecosystem and the forests and all that is just an externality. It's the tragedy, right? Because there's an incentive, which is like, I can sell that rare earth metal in there for much more than this pristine ecosystem is worth to me. Because right now it's really worth nothing in my individual little world. But the $1 billion I can get from the cobalt is definitely worth a lot, even if I have to destroy a bunch of people's livelihood. And we can look at that and be like, yo, that's fucked up, right? But then we buy the phone that has the cobalt. So there's still this market that's incentivizing it, and it's giving it fuel. So you really have to vote. You have to choose and vote with your feet and your dollars, right? Like actually your action. And so if we don't want to go into the AI porn robot dystopia, then you got to fucking stop voting for that with your attention and with your dollars. And unfortunately, people are going to vote for it, right? Like there's no way we're going to stop everybody from making that vote. And honestly, like even if everyone wanted to not make that vote, unfortunately, it's going to get so grabby and so good at hacking that even like people who are like ethically opposed might still get completely bent and sucked in just because of the gravity well is so strong, right? And it really might take some hardcore training, discernment, and will to and choice to live a more aligned, like to live a life more aligned to something that's like health and value and some sort of higher purpose. So I do see it as a tragedy of the commons that's already been playing out. You know, like you said, you got like hooked on porn as a child, as a young person, and that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy of the commons. Like that's been going on for a long time. Um, it's just going to get to the point, though. I mean, maybe we should just linger on this for one more second before we can shift out of this like dark conversation. But like, um, just lingering on the consequences of what this means, right? Because like you said, it's not just addiction to porn or to sex. It's like this addiction to novelty where and this addiction to like I can have something like exactly what I want whenever I want immediately, right? Like just by like, you know, blinking, the fucking AI knows what I want, right? Like it's going to get so adaptive at sensing what a person wants to, like predicting what you want to see, that it'll be basically morphing for you in real time while you're in this immersive VR universe in some sort of haptic feedback. You know what I mean? It's like you're basically at that level just like, what are the consequences of that? You know what I mean? Like I really think that you can go too far and you can completely just like burn out a nervous system, and you can completely like there's kind of like an empty husk of a human that's left, right? And I think that that's happening now, even now. But, you know, it's going to get worse with the technology as it exponentially changes and as the robotics catches up and everything, like as it evolves. But yeah,
Well,
what are we going to see as like the consequence of this?
I think when we begin to see men actually committing suicide, I think then we'll finally acknowledge it. But I don't even know if those suicides will end up being in the public. But I do believe that, you know, when it's robotics and you're having sex with a doll and you got a VR goggle on and you're having a fake AI girlfriend and you're stuck in that, and the company on the other side of that is effectively just you know, taking your life force, commercializing it, and all of a sudden that guy loses his job and he loses all of his friends and he loses, you know, and he's not eating and he's just doing this over and over and over again until he puts a gun in his mouth. I think that will cause us to wake up, but not until then.
Yeah, I
I know
mean,
that's kind of gnarly to say, but
yeah.
you know,
Well, I would say
yeah.
that we're seeing that on that macro on a more wide basis, because you could say like there is a suicide problem and we're the only species that does this as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like there is a suicide problem, and you can definitely make the case that pornography is symptomatic of that. Like it's part of that, right, equation. It's a complicated equation that, you know, there's a deeper wound of separation and alienation, and specifically men seem to have the hardest time, you know, when you're living a life that doesn't give you any real purpose, right? Like you don't truly belong to a creed or a tribe or a community, and you know, there's this sort of empty, hollow nature to it. And I would say that even successful people, you know, like affluent demographics, have suicide as a you know, as a thing. It's just happening. So yeah, I would say that that's a big indicator and a consequence. But you know, we've also seen this trend, if you want to call it that, playing out around gender. And there's a lot going on right now in the space as far as like, you know, environmental. I always say like biology is upstream of psychology, right? That's something Jamie's talked about a
Mm-hmm.
lot. And so what's happening to our biology is impacting our psychology. And we've got tons of pollutants and toxins in the environment that's having a direct impact on our sexuality and our gender identity and all this stuff, and our sexual development and reproductive capacity, right? Like our fertility. And I would say that part of that environmental landscape isn't just the physical, you know, the chemicals in our water and our phthalates in our food, but it's also the environment that we're engaging with our attention. So the screens, whether that be through goggles or whether it's just on your phone, but like you're engaging in some sort of there's a polluted landscape, attention landscape, right? And that pollution through pornography and through you know, this sort of race to the bottom to addict you with sexuality is, it has consequences on more than just your testosterone and on more than just, you know, like on a physical level. I would say that there's a psychological damage as well, which, is part of like when you go on this journey of healing it and you're like trying to mend the damage. I think, and you can speak to this more than I can, but it seems like men definitely struggle with just reintegrating back into a healthy, normal relationship and having like being able to have orgasms and have healthy sex with just a partner. That's like hard to do after you've completely just like blown out the circuits. Do you know what I mean? And now you've spent so much time down in these rabbit holes where like the only way you can get off is with some sort of strange combination of like anime and fucking monster porn or something, you know what I mean? And there's this weird niche that you've been kind of pigeonholed into because of this environment that's been polluted, right? That's been flooded with shit. So yeah, I just don't want to linger too long on the dark side of this. It's just like I want to just be very as clearly as we can, just say like this is real shit. This is real shit, and it's the type of shit that's like real now, but also it's this is unexplored territory, frontier space. We're the first generation in human history to have this type of thing happening. We don't know what the consequences are, right? And so just tread lightly when you're going down the rabbit hole. If you're someone who's like, nah, man, I'm just going to keep watching porn. I'm just going to keep doing my thing. Like, it might not be a road you can come back from. And that's like a legitimately like real claim today because of AI.
Well, and I'll say that in a different way, which you talked about the gender kind of, how does that all play into porn? And I'll just say that there are types of pornography that weaponize men against their own bodies and brainwash them to become a woman. And there are men that go down that path and actually do have surgical processes, which does create undeniably irreversible things that you can't actually undo, right? So understanding that there are certain pornography genres that brainwash you intentionally. You talked about Robert Anton Wilson. This is literally neurosomatic brainwashing. And when you take porn with subtitles and binaural beats and programming, and then you put it all together into a particular agenda, you can actually get men to do things that they would never do and that are not morally or ethically or in integrity at all. And then they find me and they're like, oh my God, I'm terrified. I don't know what to do. And I have to help them unbrainwash themselves from the porn.
Yeah. And that is terrifying. I had our mutual friend Coda Pipitone on the podcast, and we've talked about his journey, which he's navigated through some of that weird space. And I would say like to me, what's truly terrifying about it is we're on this exponential curve right now, and we're just really hitting it. Like we're just starting to hit this vertical. And so we don't really have good intuitions about how quickly things are going to change, and how fast the shit's being rolled out. So, your first interaction was a magazine, you know what I mean? And now, and you're, a young dude, like in our lifetimes, like in a couple of decades, we're seeing it go from like a print magazine to something that's like unimaginable at that time, like if you rewind back to when you were a kid, what we're seeing now is like unimaginable and weird. Like it's very strange. Like we're walking into an age of AI agents where you don't know what you're interacting with. You don't know if it's human or not. Like it's passed the Turing test a long time ago, right? And you've got this virtual interaction with something that feels to you and to all of your intuitions, it feels real, right? And you don't know what is on the other end of that. Like, what are the incentives? What are the motivations? And what's it trying to get out of this interaction from you? It's not like some benign force, right? There's a marketplace, there's corporate interests, there's worse things out there in the world, right? There's like people who are just like, malicious and who want to sow harm into populations, right? So yeah, what can you, like, if you're talking about the evolution of warfare and you're saying, hey, we don't need to go have a kinetic war with that country. We can just take all of their soldiers, their young men, and in a generation, we'll just eliminate any threat of a soldier ever being able to pick up arms against us because will just destroy masculinity from the inside with AI powered pornography or whatever else. So there really is like weird incentives out there, and an interesting and terrifying kind of scenario. But I don't want to like focus on just the negative, because there's a path into sacred masculinity and there's a path into sacred sexuality. And so maybe it's a good time to maybe like segue into that rosy conversation. And I know that that's been the path that you've kind of been on.
Yeah. So that year of sobriety turned into also a year of celibacy. And then that ended up turning into 2 years and 9 months of celibacy. So during that time, I started to develop my own sexual practices to teach myself how to do things that I would read about in a book or I would hear somebody talking about, but I didn't want to go join ISTA or do some sort of weird culty cult sort of sexual, tantra thing. I was just like, no, I'm gonna just learn these things on my own. So I would take psychedelics. I would have my full moon practice. So I would basically connect to myself on the moon, under the moon, and on the moon. And I basically just started to self-initiate and started to say, okay, I'm not going to necessarily take anybody's lineage or path and make it my own. I'm going to actually develop my own relationship to my own sexuality that feels intuitively self-propelling and I guess you could say, just self-oriented. And that was a wild journey, to say the least. But what I can say is that it ended up in a question. I actually have 2 maps that I teach. This is the second one that I'll share. But the second map that I'll share is basically a question, which is, if it were the last time that you were going to masturbate and you knew you were going to die tomorrow and you wanted to do it with full intention and make that as special of an experience as you possibly could, how would you do it differently than the way that you currently do it? And just sit with that. Because to me, if you sit with that long enough and you journal about it and you pray about it and you meditate on it, you begin sort of this weird path down. Oh, most of the time, the way in which we relate to masturbation is through secrecy, silence, and shame, which is, how do I quickly and as discreetly as possible get this thing done with so that I can carry on with my life or go to sleep or whatever, right? So when we decide to shift that and we say, well, what if orgasm is not necessarily the end goal and it's just to elongate this experience and to make it as connected as possible? How does that shift your relationship to sexuality as a whole? So when you stay in that path for long enough, you start to pay attention to all kinds of drivers, which is things like the cleanliness of your home, the cleanliness of your body, music, smells, aromas, toys, clothing, mirrors, inside, outside, breath work, opening your voice, and just looking at pleasure from a very different landscape. And so what I can say is if this is mindless masturbation, then mindful masturbation is just shifting from, I'm using it to feel better, and over here, I'm using it to better feel. And I mean, not just pleasure and sensation, but also the entirety of your range of emotions and accessing states of consciousness that actually massively help you to even develop different levels of spiritual development too, meaning your spiritual way of relating also shifts as you have these peak experiences through your sexual explorations. So
yeah,
I'll pause there. That was a lot.
No, that's a really cool frame. I like that shift from what'd you say? You said from feeling more, essentially, like, right?
Feeling better to better feeling.
Better feeling. Thank you.
Yeah.
So better feeling, meaning like reconnecting to the really, I mean, it's a sensory system, but it's also a sense making system, right? Like this landscape of the body, there's an instinctual element, an intuitive element, an intellectual element. There's all of these pathways that we've sort of evolved to, I don't know, like understand the world, fit in to our niche, our environment, and interact with other people and grow and evolve. There's there's something to be said about like reconnecting to that and reclaiming sovereignty of that, where you've got you know, because I would say right now it's typical for us to be stuck up in the head, you know, stuck up in our heads about overthinking and just trying to, you know, use that rational or not so rational mind for everything, including in the bedroom, including in our sexual practice with our partner or otherwise, you know, solo. It's very, and that's what porn is. Porn is all up in the head. Even if you're talking about like a toy or a robot or whatever, then some sort of like physical pleasure, it's just friction. It's friction, and then this sort of like fantasizing instead of what you're describing, which is more of like a deep embodiment practice, which is taking you into feeling, which, you know, might take you into interesting, unexplored aspects of the psyche and aspects of the body, right? Where you know, as you're moving that energy and as you're cultivating that energy through the breath, and I would imagine you've got quite a bit of breathing going on in your practice. You know, there's an opening that's happening, right? And I would say, you know, you mentioned the word spiritual. I would say that like, if you need, yeah, for me, my view of sexuality has changed radically in the last 6-7 years since I cut porn out of my life. And I was like, you know, started what you might say mindful masturbation, and then just like more intentional relationships with women, and not just seeking out, you know, like short-term gratification, pleasure, and one-night stands, but trying to cultivate like deeper. I mean, even if it's like you're not in a deep relationship where you're, you know, coupling for the rest of your lives together or something, pair bonding, you can still have sexuality that's like open, you know what I mean? And like not behind all these masks, right? And you can actually connect with another soul on a level that does feel like beautiful and even spiritual. And then having experiences where, I mean, and I'd love to hear your take on this, like the transmutation of that seminal fluid, and how you can, like, give me an example, or maybe speak to how you've used your sexual practice to, you know, open up other landscapes, right? Other than just the pleasure landscape or the, you know, the short-term get off landscape. And, you know, just to clarify, you said you were celibate for a couple of years, 2.5 years or so, but you're still doing a sexual practice. So can you speak to how those things are different?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked this question because I was actually going to go there next. So it felt like pretty synergistic that you would ask this question. But as I sat with that question of how would I do it different, and I started to kind of connect into what does a sacred sexual practice look like if I'm not taking advice from anybody else and I'm self-initiating. And that moon cycle was in my calendar. So that's like proactive. So if mindless masturbation is reactive, if it's in your calendar, then you're going to show up to that day. And so my hedonic calendar kind of morphs around my sexual practice on the moon cycle. So that's kind of like that's the core of it. And so there was a while there before I was in a relationship where, kind of at the tail end, where that day on the full moon it didn't matter what day of the week, it was a no work day. I would wake up, I would meditate, I would pray, I would go to the ocean, I would do float tanks, I would slackline, I would journal, I would microdose, I would get a massage. By the time I got to the end of got to the evening and it was dark out, I was fucking excited. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing, you know? And then I would do sometimes these hour-long practices in front of the mirror or just in my own, in my own home. And then sometimes I would go outside later and kind of finish under the moon, or sometimes it was reverse. But the point is that when you take that level of intentionality with your sexual practice and you have your orgasmic release, whether it's ejaculatory or non-ejaculatory, I've entered some of the deepest states of meditation and profound insight of my entire life. Because from those spaces, I would, ground for 30 minutes and just sit. And then I would come out of that. And that's where I would literally build my life from. I would literally build my business. I would think about different things that I wanted to write about, post about. And I was effectively initiating myself into these ideas and these ways of being. And then I was actually growing corn from that and building my life and my business and also calling in my partner. And so I can just say that when we take that level of intentionality with it and we allow ourselves to have our pleasure and have that orgasmic experience, we also don't go back in the next day and the next day and the next day for it, because we allow ourselves to really have it and we satiate in it and we really taste it and feel it and be with it. And so then we don't go back. And then when we move ourselves out into the world, we're not in that hypersexual pornographic style of relating where we're always scanning the room to figure out if there's a novel mate. And so there was this reality that when I took my sexual practice really seriously, it also freed me up to desexualize my mind so that I could actually get shit done, so that when I was in the world, I wasn't just being constantly bombarded with all of the information. So
yeah, that's great. And it's interesting because it's like hygiene, right? Like you create this healthy sort of hygienic cycle, right? And you've synchronized it with the lunar cycle, which is cool. And what that does is it's giving you like that. It's still giving you that healthy release and recharging and kind of moving and flowing. Because I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing to have it like stagnant and built up forever. Like, but you're creating this sort of circulation and this flow, and it's cyclical and rhythmic. And then you've also, you're leaving space to use that energy to create, right? Like that's the thing, is if you're constantly just unloading all of that, all those loads, and you're just unloading all that creative energy, then you're drained, right? And you lose your edge and you become soft and squishy. And there's also just like a lack of drive and motivation and inspiration too. So I've found that like reclaiming that that aspect of personhood, because it applies to women, of course, it applies to all of us, but for men specifically, I can only speak from my experience as a man, and that is that like I started actually like showing up in the world as a totally different person, like way more grounded and confident in my own skin, and not like you're saying, feeling like I'm constantly like over sexualizing every encounter with somebody who's attractive and that kind of thing. And also,
or not attractive.
Right.
I mean, just even assessing whether somebody's attractive or not is taxing, and it is life force. It's pulling life force from us.
Yeah. And then there's this kind of added bonus, which is that you're going to get more pleasure this way. Like that's been my experience. It's like your pleasure, like your orgasm experience is like an order of magnitude better than the cheap sort of sad, orgasm that you have at the end of like a porn video or something, you know what I mean? Where you don't feel like it gets depleting, you know what I mean? You don't feel like you don't feel better off after that. And also like the actual, just if you're just measuring the pleasure button component of it, you can, maybe you can speak to this, is like there's a difference between like a heady orgasm, it's just like a release, versus like a full embodied, like heart opening experience that's like on a different plane that even bends more towards the spiritual. So especially if you're with a partner where you've got this like deep intimacy where you don't have all the masks can melt away, and you can kind of experience a deeper level of union that, I mean, in my experience, there's been like a feedback loop almost, right? Where like, as your partner's experiencing pleasure and you're experiencing pleasure, there's this upward spiral, and it's kind of like this virtuous kind of feedback loop. And you can't do that without actual intimacy and without, cultivating this sort of inner openness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're talking about eros, and you said it perfectly. I think it's one of the things that I talk about. A lot of I work with couples, and a lot of couples come to me, and they can only get aroused if they're doing some sort of psychological power play. And I think that's fine to a degree, but sometimes it's a bypass. And what I mean by that is I say to them, what would it look like to take off all of the power play of power over masculine, feminine dynamics, role playing, and all of the whether it's toys or whether it's, whatever, mommy, daddy play, all that shit that happens. What would it look like to just actually be naked with your partner, both in body and emotionally and in spirit, and just actually connect and have vanilla sex and just be together and just be in a slow, really connected space. And when we move out of the pornographic style of relating, which is a program, and we start to connect to ourselves more sensually, that absolutely turns into the way in which we make love and the way in which we show up as a lover with an actual real partner. And if you're a single guy out there, it also will radically modify who shows up in your orbit as somebody who would be a potential mate, because our orientation of who we would even attract shifts when we stop relating in that pornographic style. So
yeah, totally shifts your encounters with other people and other men too. I mean, there's a whole side of this which is just like how men relate to men, and how healthy masculinity can look. And I don't know. Porn just seems to be like the most obvious example of something that's erosive or corrosive to like healthy masculinity, and femininity as well. But like there's we're speaking of this as both of us as men, so it's like that's the kind of side of the wheelhouse, I guess, that we can speak to. But there's what's the opposite of that, right? Like if you don't want the corrosive fucking acid that's coming in from the outside that's just kind of withering everything away inside, what's the upward virtuous thing, the positive feedback loop? And maybe you can describe like the tools that you're trying to help guys integrate and sort of maybe more of like the shifts that they're trying to make, like if not this, then what?
Yeah. So I think it's important just to note that having coached hundreds of men around pornography addiction and sex addiction, sometimes it goes hand in hand, sometimes it's separate. Everybody uses it for a very different reason. And a great example of this is I hired this woman. She contacted me on Instagram and we ended up partnering together, and then I ended up hiring her. But she was a cammer. So during COVID, she was seeing thousands of men over those 4 years. And they would come to her and they would ask her to do things, and then she would do those things, and there was a transaction.
On camera, right?
And so on camera. Yeah. So we built this into 12 archetypes. And basically these are different men and different socioeconomic statuses, relational statuses, with different desires of what they're asking these cam girls to do. And so we kind of built it into this really cool, archetypal work. And from that, I realized, oh my gosh, every man's desires and why they're using or how they're relating to sexuality is uniquely different and uniquely, they have different needs. Some men, they're like more like in a kinky place, right? And they're trying to explore their gender, ideas. Other men, they're in a sexless marriage and they don't want a divorce. And so they just need, to have a relationship, or they don't think that they can have the sex and the relationship, or whatever it might be, right? So we kind of went through this. And what I learned in this process is that to not assume why a man is using porn or why he's addicted to sex, but then just to help him figure out what it is. And for that, the way that I do this is I really almost always take him back to his adolescence during that time. Like for you, when you were 12 or 13, what were the ingredients that were going on in your life, in the church, family, friends? Were you a pimply kid that got bullied? Did you move? Did your dog die? Like, what were the stressors? And then as you found the porn, oh, well, this thing works really well for me to not have to feel all of the intensity of life during this particular time. And so then what we can start to see is like, okay, there's a connection between sex as stress relief, because we didn't have healthy ways of regulating our nervous system, because we didn't have the frameworks and the foundational family structures and cultural structures to hold us in a way that was sex positive and unshaming of our sexual desires. And therefore, when we can unpack that, we can start to say like, oh, okay, there's a real reason why you're using this, and then that's okay. And like, let's go back and kind of have some of those conversations with your younger boy who's still stuck back there doing that thing.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah. And man, it's tough. Like I'm shooting to become a parent, soon-ish. And that's a terrifying aspect of parenthood, right? It's like this weird thing where how can you possibly navigate, the modern age, or the whatever age we're heading into, the AI age, where the landscape's just changing so fast. It's like you don't even know what your kid's up against, you know?
yeah.
So it's hard to really have a conversation in a way that you're meeting them exactly where they're at, because it's just changing so fast. I mean, I'm thinking about my own personal upbringing. I had parents who had, all the best intentions and lots of love, and they were raising me with actual like value. Like they had these ethics and values in their life that they were trying to instill in me. So it wasn't just like a, absent, or some sort of free for all type of environment. But even in that landscape, like there's a generation gap, right? Like where they don't really have all the tools, because they didn't get the tools. Nobody gave them the tools. They didn't really have or sex positive conversations, right? From their parents and from their peers and from their educators and when they grew up. And so in some sense, there's an aspect of like, underdeveloped or just not fully, what would you say, like evolved sexuality. So, and then you're just like raising kids from that place. And then on top of that, you grew up in the age of television and radio. And now there's all of a sudden this internet thing. And then all of a sudden there's this VR thing and there's this AI thing. And there's all these other things that you've never really explored yourself. So you don't even know what's that kid's going up against.
Yeah. And so that's important because we shouldn't blame our parents for not understanding how these technologies worked and what was available on them. But I think where my mind goes when I hear that is just to acknowledge that for thousands of years, masturbation has been sinful, right? You're going to go to fiery inferno. We talked about that before we jumped on the call about how religion impacts this. And so as soon as we were even in the late 1800s, there were devices being sold to parents to put on their young boys' penises. We're talking like actual metal cages and like devices that would poke them so that they didn't get nocturnal emissions and touch themselves. And you're like thinking about that going like, holy shit. I mean, first we make masturbation and sex out of marriage sinful. So now we can commercialize that by you coming to the church and, saying I've sinned. So here, but you need to pay your, tithe or whatever it is. And then in addition to that, we're going to also sell you the solution to that, which is here, put this contraption on your child's penis. And so like, we have to recognize that for thousands of years, all of a sudden now with porn, it just popped and the cork pops so fast. And now everybody's going like, don't you take away my goddamn porn. Like this is mine. And so now we feel very destructively entitled to it because for so many generations, it was just all secrecy, silence, and shame. And so I think now what we're trying to do is like realizing, oh, we can't put that lid back on. Oh shit. Well, now we're headed towards the bottom, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So it's a bunch of like uninitiated men who are now creating the technologies and the porn that is ultimately a foundation of all of the religious shame plus the intersection of technology.
Yeah. Another one of these polarity kind of failure modes. On the one hand is the super restrictive and repressive, shameful side, right? Where it's just like sex is bad in general. I mean, sex is to reproduce. That is the point of sexuality, is just to reproduce. And if you're not doing it with a wife or like a husband, partner, right? Like somebody that you're heterosexually married to in the name of God, then that's the only condition in which sexuality is not a sin, right? So there's that perspective, and that just makes you feel like, as a kid growing up in that worldview, makes you feel kind of like a piece of shit because you're like, whoa, what's wrong with me that I have all this sinful nature, that I have all of this like desire that's, then everyone's telling me is evil. And then when you eventually capitulate to that desire, because biology is stronger than your religious story, right? Like biology is going to win out.
Mm-hmm.
And when the biology does win out, and then you're just like sitting there and instead of like a really beautiful thing that could be celebrated as part of growing up and as part of like becoming a man or a woman, it's instead kind of this shame, and you're kind of like sitting in this kind of gross place. And then on the other side of the fence is just what you just described, which is like we've been talking about for a while, which is just like this full on kind of hedonism, hit all the novelty, the pleasure buttons. And not only that, but like there's no real sacredness at all to sexuality. Whereas on the fundamentalist side, you've got like at least having children for God is sacred, right? Like it's the most sacred thing you could do. It's like a commandment. And then on the other side, it's like there's no real, everything's profane, right? So how do you take but there is more of this like, on some sense, positivity around the fact that sex is at least not shameful. Do you see what I mean? Like it's like, well, we're all into it, right? And we're all sitting here like watching porn or whatever, and like sex is, there's like it's been liberated in some sense where it's not just in the shadows. So there's value on both sides, and there's obviously problems with both. And so it's like, how do you strike that middle way again? And how can you cultivate a healthy, sacred relationship to sexuality where it's not just like, it's a sin, it's evil, and this natural thing that evolved from the earth is like considered some sort of real problem. But instead, what if we really were made in God's image? Like that idea that there's this divinity to humanity, and that. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, what comes up is, to answer that question, would be to acknowledge the amoral animal, right? That biology is going to win out over psychology, and also to understand that as humans, there's also this moral human soul spirit that's actually interfacing with this biology, the amoral animal within. And so with religion, it's like, no, we're just created of God, and therefore these urges are sinful within inside of you. But if we were to include the biology, actually, we're more like chimps. And if you look at chimps, what do we share? Like 98.7 or something % of our DNA with them. And if you study them, you're like, oh my God, well, like chimpanzees there's like infanticide, and they kill each other's babies, and there's rape, and there's all of this shit that happens inside of these chimp, communities. And for a long time, we didn't think that was happening, but now we're like, oh, it actually is happening. And so just understanding that we're not, we're not genetically wired or biologically wired to be monogamous creatures and to just do the one partner forever I do kind of thing. And so like that gets in the way of these religious ideologies and even these moral ideologies that we've overlaid on how gender expression and or monogamy or whatever should be.
Yeah, there is some tension there between the evolutionary context and background which we came from, and there's a lot to be said there about like the shadow side, and also about monogamy or polyandry or whatever, like polyamory, and just multiple, or serial monogamy, just multiple partners, right? But I don't know. As I've kind of gone through it, because I was raised fundamentalist, and I was raised in more of like the sex is bad box, right? Generally speaking. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to like make a caricature of that side of the fence, or like a straw man. I think that there's in that narrative, there's a positive aspect of sexuality, like I mentioned, and children are seen as one of the most sacred and beautiful thing about life at all, and bringing life into the world is sacred. So not to say that isn't core and important, but there definitely is like a lot of shaming around sexuality, specifically with women as well. I mean, and you were talking about, just how recently we were putting devices on young boys to stop them from touching themselves. I mean, they were pouring acid on little girls' clitorises, and you know what I mean? Like things, just horrific abuse and mutilation. And circumcision in general is just like mutilation, right? Like there's all kinds of weird kind of uh, hangovers that we're in from like the past age of, repressing sexuality, because it really is life force energy, right? And so if you can control it, if you can control someone's life force energy and subdue it, and you can kind of, control the masses that way. So there's something to be said about like liberating it, right? But not having it just go off the rails into hedonism and losing, like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that there's something really deeper and like a lot more sacred and beautiful to cultivating intentional sexuality, which is it's choice based, right? Like that's something that you have to choose to do. It's not going to be just the biological inertia or the biological sort of default to go that way.
Yeah. I want to see if you want to open up the circumcision conversation, because I have a very strong opinion about circumcision. Sure. And I've researched and studied that a lot, because when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, let's talk about that for a moment. Because and Jamie's actually helped me with this particular map that I've created. At first, when I was bringing it to him, and he was like, yo, you're speaking like this is capital T truth, like back off. And I was like, okay. So I was like, well, what is it that I'm actually getting at here? And he's like, well, this is just a mythopoetic map. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's how I feel about it. So basically the map is this. And this is kind of these are the two core principles that I teach. The first one that I mentioned earlier, which is the question around masturbation. And the second one is this, which is, it's effectively that the way that a man treats his penis is the way that he treats everyone and everything in the world. That's the idea. Okay. So the way that a man treats his penis is how he treats everyone and everything in the world. And what I mean by that specifically is, if I'm self-objectifying, meaning I'm treating myself as an object, then that's the unconscious part of the shadow, the psyche that gets projected outwards onto women, onto nature, and onto the way that I do business. So basically what I'm suggesting is that the objectification of self then creates, oh, well, this woman over here is only as good as I treat myself and relate to my own body. So if I'm treating my own body with disrespect and I'm just colonizing it, well, then of course I'm just going to colonize her, and she's just an extension of the way that I already use myself. Same thing goes with nature. We're going to take more out of the sea. We're going to cut down more of the trees than we need. It's like, if we're colonizing ourselves, then we're not going to see the value of the preservation of nature. And then the same thing goes with business. I'm going to befriend Paul to get to Peter. Paul's just a means to an end to get to Peter. And so why that feels important to me is understanding that your relationship to sexuality creates the world that you live in. Because if we stop using ourselves as a means to feel better, then we're not using other people as a means to feel better. Therefore, other people and the way we relate to other people in nature is actually the end unto itself. It's not a means. So then as we treat ourselves with loving kindness, then therefore we attract loving kindness into our lives. And we also cut off attracting people that are trying to use us as a means to an end into our life as well. So then we're no longer the victim of others as well. And then when that happens, that self-love and self-kindness and the way that we touch our own bodies and treat our own bodies ends up reflecting in the way that the world treats us. And then all of a sudden we're like, wow, now I'm really in flow. And so where this all comes from, though, is this circumcision piece, which is like, well, why do we objectify ourselves in the first place? And I have a theory, and my theory is, and this again also came to me on a 10-gram mushroom journey, that whole map, but it basically showed me very clearly that when a child's coming out, like for me, I was born at 7:36. At midnight, I was circumcised. I mean, we're talking like hours old. And then my mom heard me crying in the room, and then I got brought back over to my mom. And so the reality of that is, like, my whole theory is that that's the original mother wound, because we come from our mothers. We don't have an ego identity or a gender. We have no expression of who we are. We're just like an open vessel. But then we immediately experience pain. And the only thing that we can relate to is, well, we don't even know that we've been passed to our mom. We don't even have our eyes open really for the most part. Right. So then this woman, this mother that we came from, now we're immediately being hurt, harmed, and something has been taken from us against our will. This is a non-consensual behavior. So from my point of view, that snip was the moment when something was taken from us, whereby which, as we're growing in our adolescence, that informs our psychological development, whereby which we then feel destructively entitled to take from others as well. So if something's taken from us, now I'm destructively entitled to take from her or from nature or from whatever. And so I see, in my father's generation, it was 90% of Americans were being circumcised. Now today it's about 55%. So thank God we're going in the right direction. But until we stop circumcising our babies, I don't know if this is going to, if this is just going to continue. I think we have some time before we're going to get to that place where we realize that this is a cosmetic surgery and it is not in any way, shape, or form about the health of the child. As long as you do healthy practices and teach them how to pull the skin back, like most children can make it through that process and it's fine. So anyways,
yeah, if it got through the filter of evolution, it's probably all right. If it was really so maladaptive that your dick was gonna fucking get diseased and rot and fall off, then those dicks can't reproduce, and you're not gonna see it get through the evolutionary filter. So that whole idea has never really held much water for me. It did at a time when I was brainwashed, when I was inside of the story, the ideological box, which is to say that like, oh, it's normal, it's healthy, there's like this hygienic, reason for it. So there's this kind of Western medicine box that it's part of, but that's not even, even that's not even about medicine. It actually goes, like, if you trace the roots of that, like in his book, Sex at Dawn, Chris Ryan talks about this, but the roots of circumcision in the West, in like modern medicine, go back to a fucking creep, to a dude who was this guy, I forgot his first name, his last name's Kellogg, and he's a doctor who was abusing young children. He was, like I said, pouring acid on little girls' clitoris, and he would sew foreskin shut, and just like weird shit like that, just to stop masturbation. It was all rooted in religious fundamentalism, right? So it wasn't actually there wasn't actual hygienic. It's not hygienic. It's not better. Like, the evolution evolved our bodies the way they are. I don't want to say intentionally, but like there's nothing's left. I would say there's a good reason. There's an evolutionary purpose for all of it, right? And it's a bummer. And so I agree with you. I think as long as we're still circumcising little boys, I could rant about this for a while, because I'm circumcised, and I've had not by choice, of course. I was also a tiny child. I don't know how old I was, if it was hours or days, but I know it left a wound and a trauma. And, if people are like, oh, you're just being a little baby, it's like, fucking pussy, you don't remember, what's your problem, right? And it's fine. Well, it's actually, no, it lives in the body. So like all trauma, it lives in the body. And your body's an intelligently evolved fucking bio machine. It's one of the most insanely it's honestly a miracle. Like, the human body is like a miraculous, it's like nature's crowning jewel, especially like the brain. So but I had an experience in a float tank. So just to give you a little context, I had this my whole life I've had problems with my root and my hips being really tight and locked up, and my low back having issues. And that turned into a surgery at 12 to put a screw in my left hip. And I just had like this, I had lots of just locked up tension in my low back. And I had a hip problem where my left hip kept sort of slipping out of its socket. So they put a screw in there, and it was in there for like 12 years. And it wasn't until I discovered this magical combination of shout out to Joe Rogan, this magical combination of cannabis, edible cannabis, Wim Hof breath work, float tank, right? And the first time I ever did that was just like this paradigm shifting, life changing experience. And part of the experience was I had this sort of, for the first time in my life, I had this inside out awareness of the subtle body, of the energetic body, which at the time I had no language for, because I'd never really experienced it directly. And, you know, as far as I could tell, it was just like this woo woo talk, you know, like chakras and all that shit's all, you know, just this woo hippie nonsense. But when you experience it directly, you know, to me, that kind of gnosis or direct knowledge is so much more valuable than any sort of textbook or like anecdote from someone else. So having experienced that, the big aha moment, which was sort of terrifying, was like, holy shit, I've got this piece of metal in my fucking body. And I'd like forgotten about it. Like my conscious mind, it was gone out of my conscious mind, but like down in the deep unconscious, as I'm in this interesting sort of like frontier where I'm exploring the body from the inside in the float tank for the first time, I have this like new side of my brain kind of realizes the metal's there, right? It's more of like a deeper intuitive side, like an instinctual side. And that aspect was freaked the fuck out that I had metal in my body, right? Like I was like, whoa, what am I going to do about this? This felt like some alien, and I felt violated, like this alien invasive thing in there. Well, anyways, I'm just trying to paint the context, but like there's a long road, 10 months later of lots of floats and yoga, started a yoga practice. And then I'm down in the jungle down in Colombia on a ceremony, on a retreat. And I'm in a Wachuma ceremony connecting with the fire. And this was like grandfather, masculine energy, just amazing comfort comes to me. This confidence comes to me of like, okay, time to go get this fucking screw yanked out, you know, time to get this out of my body. Like this is what I've been working for. And I fly back to the States and I pay a surgeon, pull the screw out. And the very, very next day, because they told me no water for 2 weeks, can't, you know, keep the bandage dry, all this stuff. And I'm like, actually, it's not going to work. She's like, why? I'm like, well, because I'm floating tomorrow. And she's like, what's a float tank? I'm like, don't worry about it, honey. You don't need to worry about it. So I waterproofed the bandage. I jumped in a float tank the next day. And by jumped, I mean gingerly stepped, because I was post surgery. So, and I popped an edible, and this was the first float with the screw not obstructing my body's ability to move and to whatever, right? And this is also on the back of like, you know, just coming back from South America and doing a couple of ayahuasca retreats over a couple of months. So I just cleaned out a lot, in other words, right? And I'm in a new vessel, and it's always interesting when you have these breaks from the tank, and then you come back and you meet the new version of yourself, and it's like this whole integration process. So I really love. But this was one of the most intense re-entries back into the tank that I've ever had, because I just did all this medicine work, cleaning out a lot of, I can't even, it's hard to even just package that into a small sentence. I like died and was reborn. I had like this entire transformative, you know what I mean? Like, how do you even talk about that? But like, I come back, get the screw out, hop in the tank. And I'm just saying all of this just to validate what you're saying, which is to say that memory, that somatic memory, that trauma came up from my hips, came up from my root, and I experienced it in the tank of my circumcision. And this might sound like crazy. This might sound crazy to people.
So let me just make sure I'm tracking you. So what you're saying is that you realize that the circumcision itself created the alignment of your hips, which then led to you having all of those difficulties. Is that what I'm hearing?
I can't say for certain if the circumcision is what caused it, or if this is a deeper pattern that goes, it's more karmic or ancestral, because there's a whole like rabbit hole there of like, is this something that would have happened regardless, whether I got circumcised or not? Is it a genetic thing? Or is it a later trauma that came after being circumcised? So I can't say that like all of my problems came from the circumcision, but what I'm saying is that the moment that I was circumcised, I mean, what do you think happens when you take a fucking young child, a baby, right? And you mutilate their genitals, right? And for anyone who's like getting polarized by me saying that. Um, trying to trying to put on my worldview for a second, like don't just for a second, try it on. Just try it on for a second. Try it on for size and see what you think. Right? Like it's the sign of a well adapted, person and a thinker to be able to try on other people's perspectives. You don't have to agree with me, but my experience from the inside, from my own memory, embodied memory, and it wasn't like a vision of like visual. It was more of like a somatic experience, right? Like an emotional somatic thing. Because what happens when you take a baby or anyone and you mutilate their genitals? Like if I was to do this to you as an adult, you'd be a fuck you. That's horrific. Like, you'd try to fight me, you'd stop me. But like a baby is helpless. So you do it to the baby and there's this cascade of emotions, right? And pain, like you said, there's pain, but there's a cascade of emotion as well. And the emotion that came up for me in the float tank was this deep wound and this sense of betrayal. So it was a sense of like, what just happened? You know what I mean? Like it was like a violation of trust. That was the emotion to it. And obviously like just sadness and grief and pain and all those other, things all at once, like a cocktail of just intensity. And I was like crying and just like, processing it in the tank. But the interesting one that stuck with me was this idea of betrayal. And it's like, whoa, if you wanted to clip my wings, you know what I mean? If you wanted to domesticate me, then you would do something like that. Like why on earth would you take new life that's, got all of this, it's fucking God incarnate. Like it's, you know what I mean? It's this beautiful expression of cosmos and immediately traumatize it. Right. Like that's just anyone whose ideology tells them to do that. You better, I would say, start asking some questions as to why are you subscribed to this? Right. And why is this in the fucking book of things we have to do? Right. Or why is the doctor telling us to do this? Like those are questions you should ask. I think it's irresponsible of any parent to, just because we're tribal primates who are wired up to conform to our society and our social norms, right? And to go with the flow of what the collective is doing. And we have that sort of herd psychology effect. Just because of that, I think it doesn't take away your responsibility as a parent to protect your child and to give them, like every chance to have a happy, healthy life, including not maiming them and fucking up their sexual development. Like that is going to have downstream effects on how much pleasure they can actually experience with their partner down the road, right? And like you were saying, what if it's creating this deeper wound where now they're just going to start objectifying themselves and objectifying women and objectifying nature and objectifying the world, and there's a world full of conquistadores, you know what I mean? People who are colonializing and conquering.
Yeah. And so, well, first off, I just want to say thank you for sharing your story. That's very intimate, and I could feel what you went through in my own way. And I can sense that had a profoundly different or a profoundly unique reorientation to your entire way of being in the world, because to acknowledge circumcision as betrayal would be like, okay, well, that's the original experience of my life, effectively the very first thing, other than, people say that being born is traumatic. I'm not necessarily on board with that idea, but I will say that having your dick chopped, when you're an infant, is definitely traumatic. And going back to your point about trauma is not the event. It's not what happened to you. It's not the circumcision or me. It's the leftover energy in the system when something happens too much, too fast, or too soon. So in this case, obviously circumcision is too much, too fast, too soon, all, at the same time. And where I want to go with this is just to say that, we're having this conversation with Chris Beisch, LSD in the Mind of the Universe, next week. And we're going to have him come in for the book club that we're in. And I want to ask him about that. I want to say, hey, were you circumcised, if you're willing to share? And did you encounter anything in the experiences that you had around that particular topic. Because the reason why that's important to me is because my 10-gram mushroom journey was not only me feeling into the intensity of my own circumcision, but it was also feeling into the transpersonal collective trauma of all of the circumcisions and the impact on the planet simultaneously. And so it was unbelievable. I mean, it was the most terrifying and painful experience I could ever. I mean, what he's sharing in the book is like identical to what I went through as it related specifically to circumcision and the impact on the planet. And my whole thing on this, and if Jamie's on the call, that'll be interesting because him and I have gone rounds on this and he constantly is trying to throw it out. But I think people that are trying to throw out the circumcision conversation haven't had an experience like you or I, and therefore they're not able to go there and actually feel into the entirety of that particular reality and how that impacts our collective evolution. I mean, maybe, and this is just my theory, but maybe that snip was when we went from being non-dual thinkers into duality. You know, maybe that was the moment when we began to be separated from ourselves. And therefore that created this, you know, land and body is different versus land and body is the same as one. You know what I mean?
I think that there's a natural and healthy evolution of consciousness, which organically separates, right? Because the baby is born in this sort of unified field of consciousness, right? In other words, that's the default state of consciousness, of reality. We're just we've grown to we've evolved an identity and a narrative structure and a, you know, sort of psyche construct that's places us within that, and we can get trapped inside of that structure as forgetting that we are not separate from it, right? And the baby hasn't forgotten that. The baby is like only in it, right? It's just it. And I think there's a healthy transition, and then there's the, like you said, too fast and too soon, too much, too fast, too soon, snip. And now you're just immediately like you were just in the womb, right? And this sort of groovy kind of like oneness. And I would say the birth is probably can be fairly traumatic and can be very traumatic. I mean, you're getting, especially getting cut out, which a lot of them are now. You know, they're getting cut out of their mom, which is hardcore. So, yeah, we're cutting out all the babies and then we're snipping them. That, or at least half, right? Like that's wild. That's just a wild fucking two things to say in the same sentence. It's just a weird thing that's happening in our species right now. Both of those things are pretty weird. I understand like saving mom from, you know, child mortality and like, you know, childbirth can be incredibly risky and intense, but yeah, like,
and my whole thing is we're just sitting here masturbating to porn all the time. What if the circumcision trauma is, what if that's the reason why we're so addicted to masturbation? What if we're all pointing, hey, something down here went wrong. Something's not right with my penis. Can you help me? And not having an ability to actually voice that. You know, like what if this thing's all wound up and there's a you know, a connection. And again, how do you study this shit? People go, oh, well, you got to look. I mean, there's some people that have studied it and what they found is not obviously causation, but correlation, where when you look at the countries in the world with the highest circumcision rates, you have the highest violence of men on women. And so from that perspective, you're like, well, the data's, you know, showing some correlation to like, you know, circumcision creating, you know, the violence of, you know, you look at certain countries in Africa, you look at, you know, sort of Arab countries and things of that nature, and you just like see high violence in that. So, you know, if that's the original mother wound, is that just men taking out that aggression on, you know, on the women, you know? And again, I'm obviously jumping to crazy conclusions here that are really difficult to understand, but these are the questions that I sit with sometimes around the circumcision stuff.
And it's important to, like, as you were referring to the mythopoetic map, right? Like there's not to mistake the map for the territory. And it is interesting to speculate and to sort of try to create a map and see what's going on. I mean, there clearly, I would say it's not too much of a jump or an assumption to say that there is a deep wound between masculine and feminine. And I mean, to me, that seems incredibly obvious. If you just look at the history of women and in modern in our civilization, like the track record of how we have suppressed feminine sexuality and just women in general and how they've been subjugated, right? And to where does circumcision come from? Well, it comes from the Old Testament. It comes from Abraham, and it's a Judeo-Christian practice, but particularly started in the Jewish tradition. So the Hebrew Bible.
And he did it to himself. Didn't he do it to himself as the original circumcision? Is that from what I remember?
That guy's a mad lad if he can cut his own dick, but like apparently, like maybe that's, I can't remember exactly if he did it to himself or not, but he was like the beginning of the tradition. And it was like you're marking the lineage to sort of like make them distinct. And now they're like, it's kind of an initiation, and it's saying like you are one of this creed, so you have to be circumcised to be a Jew in this lineage. So what does that tell us, right? Like we're talking about Father Abraham. We're talking about the patriarchal lineage, right? I mean, this is one of the most patriarchal traditions in the world, right? Like it's heavily male dominated society. So in a male dominated society, and then there's this sort of like mutilation of males, and those males are that's like in my mind, the beginning of the domestication process and the indoctrination process, and bringing somebody into your culture, into your way of seeing the world, and into your way of seeing the universe. It's not to say it's all bad. I'm not saying that like, down with the Jews or anything like that. I'm saying that like with anything, it's a mixed bag. There's obviously lots of beautiful values and things that come out of, all religions. And then there's also these weird things, right? Like genocides that happen. And you're like, how could you kill all those people in the name of God? How could you burn all those witches in the name of Jesus? It doesn't make any sense to me, right? How could you cut all those little boys, right, in the name of Father Abraham? Like after I had this experience in the float tank, I asked my dad about it. I was like, first of all, you can imagine his fucking expression. He's a boomer, and I'm telling him I was in this float tank and I experienced my circumcision. He's like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Right? So he's like, what? And then he's also like, "Yeah, well, it's the law from the Bible. It's like Father Abraham." So that's why I chose to do it, because my mom sort of defaulted like, we did it because your dad wanted to, and it was a biblical decision, and it wasn't really a medical thing in my case. And so those are the two big reasons for doing it, mostly, is like either some religious reason, or there's some sort of weird myth that it's going to be better for hygienic reasons. Or I would say a third one is that dad got snipped and he wants his kid to look like him, right?
That's often why.
Yeah, it's an ego thing. So, but, why would we take this thing that's like fucking, I don't know, 4,000 years old, this story, right? And perpetuate it out another 4,000 years and just lead, like, if you keep doing what you did, you're going to get what you got, right? And what have we gotten from the past? Well, we've gotten a bunch of fucking colonializers, empires, war, and it's not all negative, but there's a lot of things that have been negative. And I think that it's worth being critical and asking the question, like, why are we actually doing this? And circumcision is a really good example, because it's so fucking obvious when you take the blinders off. Like once you take the cultural, I have to belong and think how everyone else thinks. Once you take that off and you can kind of like make your own opinion, come to your own conclusion, rationalize that for me. Like, give me the scenario in which it's a good idea to just like mutilate any human's genitals ever.
Well, I mean, it also reduces pleasure. So I think that they were doing that to mitigate,
Right.
To mitigate them from having masturbation and sex before marriage. And you can, if you talk to women, it's also less pleasure for them too, right? So it's not just a sort of marking of God, but it was also just like we're going to control your desire for having pleasure. And we all know that doesn't work. I mean, doesn't matter if you're circumcised or not circumcised, you can get addicted to porn and you can masturbate, 10 times in one day. So it just sucks. Yeah. And from my perspective, if there is a psychological aspect to something being taken from you and we register that, how does that not show up in the way that we treat the world? And that's my whole thing, is if that map actually is of value, it's that the way that we love our body and not use it as a means to an end does impact the way that we actually live in this world. And that's sort of like why I think it's so critical that we don't start children off that way from the get-go.
Yeah. So I really like this 80-20 frame. How can you find the small percentage of inputs that are responsible for the majority of the outputs? So where are the most efficient levers to pull for like real growth, change, progress, transformation? And so in the case of what we've been discussing around, this trauma from the beginning, a lot of men's lives, from, circumcision onto like early exposure to pornography and sort of this objectification of sexuality from like the whole culture that we're part of, right? And sex sells, so like the commodification of all that. So going from that background, coming from there, and trying to move towards sacred sexuality, towards embodiment that's healthy, and as you said, feeling more, right? And utilizing our sexual energy in a sort of intentional and purposeful and sacred way, because it really is. It's like all you have is the seconds here on earth, like we're all just like the present's a gift, and we're all just here for some, it could be over at any moment. And so like what you do at that time is critical. So what I'm getting to is 80-20. What's the one thing, if you could only pick one thing, that you would have guys do to shift their reality away from this dystopia that we're sliding into a more beautiful world of sacred masculinity and sexuality?
This is going to be a little bit of a strange answer, but I'm going to say it anyways, which is take your masturbation practice into nature. So in other words, go out into nature without your device. And don't go to a park. Go somewhere where you're going to be alone and without a device, and take off all your clothes and sun your balls and get some sun. And if you feel aroused at all, then work towards developing a connection to what I call eco-eroticism, which is most people only look at eroticism through an ego-related lens, which is man-woman or man-man, which is I need another human being. What would it look like to move sexuality into an eco-erotic place, which is to understand that we can be in connection with nature, because nature's always fucking. Everything in nature is fucking, whether it's, a squirrel or a fucking, whatever, you know what I mean? Like, even if you just dig up some soil, things are having sex, right? Things are propagating, things are growing. And so if we only look at sex as this thing that we're doing digitally in our own homes and secrecy, silence, and shame, like, what does that look like to actually explore sexuality in the environment that we're naturally wired to connect in for thousands of years before we got domesticated into this way of being? So that would be sort of the be curious and just see what happens.
It sounds like rewilding to me. So that feels like, that's a good advice. And it really is like, it can be a very liberating and empowering thing, because it's the opposite, right, of the secret, silent shame thing. It's like, no, I'm right here. Like, I'm out in the open, and I belong in this environment, right? And it's like, there's something really different psychologically about that.
Oh my gosh. When I first started doing this, I was always like, oh my gosh, who's looking? Just like over your head, looking around. And then you think about God or like, some spirits or guides or angels. And so I would always trip out about like, who's watching this? And so then that would obviously, cause me to go under the covers. Nobody can see, nobody can, this is just my little thing. But when you do that, you start to claim your place you unshame your sexuality and you claim your voice, you claim your place. You're like, yeah, I'm fucking out here. I'm fully exposed. This is good. And this feels amazing. And you start to see that like the light hits just the right way. The birds chirp, like the stream's beautiful. And you're like, oh my God, like nature's actually on my side. Like they're happy about this. It's not like this thing that we need to be all like,
Yeah. You're like, what
just be careful.
This podcast for like prescribing people to like run around and like jerk off out in publicly. Yeah. the I'll say the first time I ever had an experience like that was expansive and mind opening about sexuality and nature. I was on my partner and I, my now wife, we were camping in a rooftop tent, and we were in this beautiful spot up in the Pacific Northwest by a river, and no one else around. Like, we had this entire area to ourselves, and we built a fire. I built a fire, and we ended up fucking by the fire out in the open, right, instead of up in the tent.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time I've ever done anything like that. And I had this experience when I came where I just had this energy go all the way up my spine and just out the crown. And it was just this, I felt like a fucking like rewilded man. Like, it was a totally different, I don't know how else to explain it. It was very strange. And maybe that's a little overshare, but it was, just backing up what you're saying. I think there is something to be said about that. And it's the opposite of the shame story, it feels like.
Yeah. And then when we can take that into partnership, as you just mentioned, that's the goal. That's, in my experience, what we're all looking for in the porn. What we're really looking for is a partner in nature, having that, Kundalini rising experience out the top of the crown. That's what we're actually striving for. That's what we want. Eros with safety, with nature, in a fire. Like, that's what we're going for. So, like, don't confuse this little phone as the fire. This little digital thing is not the fucking fire, guys.
Yeah. And honestly, like, that, you could extrapolate that out way beyond sexuality and just into tribe and community, right? Like, how much of our connection is just this pseudo connection? I mean, even now we're talking through these screens, which, I would prefer over no conversation at all. But like, when we can meet together around an actual fire, there's a different kind of quality to it. There's a different magic to it. And I would say that the fire was actually the attractor for the tribe. It brought everyone into the same space around, the most powerful technology, the first technology, right? The Promethean fire of the gods, like what seeded most likely consciousness, right? In the sense of self-awareness and language and all this stuff evolved around fires and cooking food around fires and sharing stories around fires. And so that's like the most deep layer. Like, that's all the way down at the bottom of the tribal primate stack, right? And sexuality happened around those same environments, right? And if you look at the bonobos and our cousins, like, they were probably all doing it, right? So there's like there's a deep fucking deep fucking, and then there's a deep there's a deep connection to nature and to the fire. And so I'm a big fan of your advice to get out there. I mean, if you just leave your phone, like, don't bring porn with you to nature. Like, just get out there and do your thing, and explore it. Like, get curious about it again, right? And try to meet another version of yourself. I would add one other piece of advice, which was the thing that really helped me shift out of compulsive porn addiction. And I've watched porn a few times since, primarily with my partner, and it's always like, every time, like, it's always like spread way out, and it's like, maybe this time it'll be good, you know what I mean? And it's like, every time I do, I'm always a little bit like disappointed. Like, it's honestly, I way prefer just connecting on a deeper intimacy level with her versus like having this third thing that we're both trying to observe.
What I can say to that is I recommend men, if you like porn, don't consume it, create it. Now, obviously, don't upload it to the internet, but like, setting up a camera and taking it intentional and then rewatching you and your partner is an incredibly healing experience. And it's very, very erotic in a beautiful way. So that's my recommendation for people. Just make sure you do not put that into somewhere where it can get
Tyson's
fucking
like,
zapped.
get naked out in public and jerk off and then film it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, got it. So, but like, there's this Mark Manson's book Models. He talks about this masturbation diet where first you obviously cut out porn, and you cut out any and all masturbation except for one intentional day a week, right? So like you were saying, you have a whole sort of ritual built up, right? Like leading up to it. And that's his advice too, is like, really give it the time to enjoy it and to make it a special thing. And it's just once a week thing. So you're kind of looking forward to it. and, you know, like, don't hurry through the process, like enjoy the process. Right. And the only other caveat is when you jerk off, when you masturbate, you can't fantasize about somebody that, unless it's somebody that you would actually have sex with. So it can't be this like
Mm-hmm.
weird, fucked up taboo fantasy, right? Just to, get you off. It has to be, try to make it somebody that you actually want to connect with. Right. Right. And it makes it more of like a real tangible sexual experience versus getting more and more up and away in this abstraction space, right? So just by doing that, I was able to completely change my relationship to my dick, and it really is. It's a powerful, like you're saying, it's a very powerful relationship that most guys are just compulsively having. They're not actually consciously aware of what that relationship is like, whether they're single or in a relationship with a partner. So it's interesting. We've been talking about it for a couple hours, and it's like, for most people, this is a conversation that they just never have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I have it every day and I love having it. And, we need to have this conversation more and more. One of the things that I always say is like, why does men's work leave sex at the door? Because you have a ton of men's organizations. There's one up in LA that my friends are a part of, that Coda's a part of. There's, Sacred Sons is the biggest one in America, actually in the world. There's several other ones. And a lot of these big ones, they literally have no sexual component. And so men are coming and they're doing all this deep work and they're rooting and rawing and they're hitting their chests and they're getting all like into their anger and rage and all this. And yet the sex piece is just not there. And so my whole thing on that and my take on it is, that there's just so much sexual shame and there's so much taboo with it all. And the leaders haven't integrated their own sexual shadow. And so then they create these men's work movements and then they just leave it out. And then what ends up happening is that people inside of the organization end up having these issues that, end up, happening. So my whole thing is like, if you're a part of a men's group and you're out there doing men's work and you're listening to this, or you're, thinking about it, just make sure you ask that question. Hey, like, do you guys even discuss these things? Because all the men's groups that I'm a part of, sex is a central theme. And we kind of open the men's work from that relationship to sex and sexuality.
Yeah.
So it's important.
Yeah. And if you're talking about the fastest, like 80-20, once again, the fastest lever, the way in to healthy masculinity, it's got to start around sexuality to me, because that's like, it's all the way down at the core, at the root of how we relate as humans, as men, to the world and as to other beings, other men, other women. So, like my men's group, that's something we definitely talked about is pornography use and ways in which to actually change patterns and to have a healthier dynamic. It needs to, like, men's work, men's groups in particular, you don't even have to have some sort of like, coach or something like that, even though it's probably can be helpful, can be nice. But the reality is we just need each other. We need brothers coming together around a fire again and, piercing the veil, so to speak, of like this whole fucking taboo closet of things that we can't talk about, and realizing we're all in this fucking environment together. We're all stuck in the AI robot, sex robot apocalypse, together. Like we're all in it. So it's like, why don't we support each other and have these conversations? They don't have to be public conversations. And it's something actually really sacred about that container of, intimacy and confidentiality and trust, and being able to put it to voice, and to voice your, your trauma, your shame, your whatever it is. And actually just through dialogue, there's this exfoliation, this healing process that occurs, just by bringing it into the light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. We went for it.
Yeah. It's the first time I've gone this direction on the pod. So thanks for being you, and for bringing it here and bringing the heat, and for the work you're doing. It's been eye-opening for me. But where can people, men in particular, who are interested, or women who are interested in getting help for their man or whatever, like, where can people find you if they're interested in seeking out what you're offering, and what exactly is it that you're offering?
Yeah. Yeah. So my website's not quite ready, so I can't point anybody at a website, but you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Tyson Adams, and just message me. I mean, that's the easiest way. But I am launching a program this summer. It's called Retain Your Life Force. So it's 6 modules, which is semen retention, outgrowing porn, sex transmutation, which is like working with the root of the body and moving energy through the different channels. And then mindful masturbation, sexual reflexology, which is a lot of that penis stretching exercises. And then lastly, becoming multi-orgasmic. So from the way I like to say it is from meh to, effectively that journey,
Nice.
right? And it's basically a combination of an online course and community, one-on-one coaching with me via text, and then also group calls that you get to be a part of for 12 weeks. So you get to come in on Mondays and either Thursday or Friday mornings, and you actually get to be a part of group calls where I do group coaching effectively. So, and then there's an accountability partner system as well for those that are, going through a porn addiction. We have that all set up. And so it's basically going to be my offer, and I'm going to have open enrollment and people can come and go as they want. And this is a sort of a culmination of 8 years of work coming finally into focal piece of like, into focus, that this is the work I'm bringing to the world. This is my soul centric, gift to humanity to help, just up level the consciousness on the planet. So I'm jazzed about it.
That's epic. It's awesome. And it's so important. I think that, if we're looking at any of those, areas that are going to be high yield, high reward for the effort put in, sexuality is, it's so clutch. It's so key, because you're talking about your literal bank of your reservoir of life force. So, and I know that sounds woo to people, but it really is like, it's pretty obvious to me. Once you start to, like you said, everything in nature is fucking, like there is a masculine, feminine kind of polarity to the universe. And there's this dance, this sexuality dance in all of it. And that's happening inside of us. And as men, how can you be part of that dance in a beautiful way, in a sacred way, in a intentional way, and be, stepping into your power. And actually, this is the piece that most people seem to miss, is like, not just step into your power and dominate, but step into your power in service, and actually offer your power, your staff, that phallic symbol of like power, right? Connecting heaven and earth, like being able to take the ethereal, the abstract, the imaginative, and actually manifest it in the world, right? That's what the power of masculinity can do. And you can use that to fucking drop bombs on people, or you can use that to build bridges, right? Bridges or fences.
Yeah. Totally. Love that. Cool. Yeah. Great point.
Cool. Hey, man. Well, Tyson Adams on Instagram. Thanks for your time, Tyson. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Christian.